share are going to be kind of sharp and pointed, but the reason for that is, again, the focus today is on the prevention, stopping it before it happens. And sometimes, we got to hit hard some of these things. And so, again, if this is something that has touched your life or your family, it's in no way meant to condemn. In fact, toward that, I would preach toward redemption and for restoration and for healing, because God can bring healing even through the worst of situations. And we know that He is a God of redemption. So I wanted to make that point as I prepare to share this message with you. And before I get to the text, I want to tell a story that I heard some time back about this one preacher one Sunday night who wanted to have a sing-along with his congregation. They used to call them sing-spirations, and some of you have probably attended those. And he said, I'm going to holler out a word, and I want you to say the first song or the first hymn that comes to your mind, and we'll sing it. And so he says, cross. And somebody says, the old rugged cross. And so they begin singing that great hymn of faith. And then he says, grace. And somebody, of course, says, Amazing Grace. And so they sing that great song. And then he says, power. And somebody says, there is power in the blood. And so the congregation joins in singing. And then, to everyone's shock, the preacher says, sex. And there's just like stone silence. Everyone's just baffled. They're all looking straight ahead, nervous about who's going to say what. There's silence for a while, and finally an elderly lady in the back stands up and says, precious memories. Well, this sermon title for today, I wish I could take credit for. I came across this at some point, although I learned something about it just this week. And you've heard that expression, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Well, somebody rephrased that to say you can't have your Kate and Edith too. And like I said, I wish I had thought of that. But I did a little research, and that was actually a top 10 song in 1967 by the Statler Brothers. Go figure. Really? There you go. You can't have your Kate and Edith too. Pretty creative. You know, that was worth your coming this morning, if nothing else. No, I'm kidding. This is not a show, but it's about God and our worship today. And I want to share with you Matthew 5, beginning at verse 27. This is a text that Jesus shares with us in the Sermon on the Mount that comes back from Exodus 20. Remember, the commandment is just 5 words, thou shalt not commit adultery. But then Jesus expounds upon that. In verse 27, he says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. More and more people seem to have forgotten the wise words of Henry Ford, who, when he and his wife were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, someone asked him what the secret was to the longevity of their marriage. And Henry Ford said, it is the same as in the automobile business. Stick with one model. It's good advice, isn't it? Good advice. One of the things I want to lay out here at the very beginning, because this is sometimes misunderstood by a lot of people, but yet it's a very basic premise upon which to build. And that is that sex was God's idea. Okay, it was God's idea. It was not something that was invented in Hollywood. It's not something that developed during the sexual revolution of the 1960s, but it was God's idea. And because of that, sex is good, it is wholesome, it is even a holy act when it is carried out between a husband and a wife in a marital relationship. And so the problem, therefore, is not with sex per se, but the problem is sex outside of the bounds of holy matrimony between a husband and a wife. Therefore, anytime two people engage in sexual activity, if they're not husband and wife, if they're not married as husband and wife, then it is outside the parameters of what God has ordained. He did not do that to prevent the human race from having a good time. He didn't do it to squelch our fun. But he did it to protect us because he knows what a personal and holy act it is, and as such, it needs to be placed within its proper context. Now, when Jesus elaborated on this particular commandment in the New Testament, he talked about two different kinds of adultery. He talked about physical, and he talked about mental. Now, first of all, with the physical act, that certainly harkened back to the Old Testament, something that the people were accustomed to hearing for sure, since it was one of the Ten Commandments. And as I think about this today, it is amazing to me, as it is, I'm sure, to all of you, how standards and expectations and attitudes have changed about adultery over the years. I was remembering in school how we read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. It was written in 1850, and it tells the story of a woman who committed adultery and became pregnant, and she was forced to wear the letter A on her dress, which stood for adulteress, and she was put on display in public. Now, I'm not in favor of that, just in case you're wondering. I don't think we should publicly shame people for their sin. But consider that and compare it to this, all right? I heard a story recently about a group of women, 12 women, who were taking a course on the French language together. They'd all gone out to lunch one day. And during the course of conversation, the topic got on the subject of infidelity. And one of the women asked in this group, how many of you have been faithful to your husband throughout your marriage? Okay, how many of you have been faithful to your husband? Only one person out of the 12 raised her hand. Now, later that night, one of the women that was in that group was telling her husband about that conversation, and she said to him, I was not the woman that raised her hand. Well, the husband, of course, was devastated when he heard that, because is this a confession that you've been cheating on me? And she quickly reassured him and said, no, honey, I haven't been cheating on you. I've been faithful to you. And so he asked her, then why didn't you raise your hand? And she said, because I was too ashamed. Too ashamed to raise your hand to say I've been faithful? Too embarrassed to say I've been loyal to my husband? That's hard to fathom. That's like being ashamed that you're the only healthy person during an epidemic. Or being ashamed that you have survived a tornado or an earthquake in Oklahoma. I mean, to be ashamed for something that's right, being ashamed of something that's godly, that just blows my mind. How a person could be ashamed. But that's an example of how in the minds of many, the attitude toward adultery has changed over the years. I'm thankful it's not looked upon that way in every circle of friends, but that just really struck me when I read that. Now, Jesus, though, does take this commandment further, doesn't he? In verse 28, when he says that whoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. And of course, that could also be turned around, that if a woman looked upon a man in that way, too, it would be equivalent to adultery, the same both ways. I would imagine that if you had been present in the crowd that day, when Jesus spoke the words of verse 28, you may very well have heard a gasp go through the people that could have been heard quite a distance away. I can just imagine somebody kind of nudging the person next to him and say, did he just say what I think he said? That if you just look upon a woman with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery? Because you see, this was new. I mean, Jesus had talked about, the Old Testament had talked about adultery in a physical act, and even the 10th commandment says that you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife, but to equate it with adultery in our hearts and minds was a level that, from what I can see, hadn't quite been introduced yet. And so people were pretty, I would think, kind of shocked by those words of Jesus. But it's important to understand as we think about this that Jesus is not saying that a mere look of a woman, if you're a man, or a man if you're a woman, is equivalent to adultery. It's important for us to understand that, but to look upon a woman with lust in the heart, and there's a difference. He's talking not about a glance, but a gaze. Not about the sight of a woman, but the stare at the woman that he's talking about. It has more to do than just observance. For example, you can't help but notice what a person looks like. And you certainly can't help if you notice an attractive person that walks in the room or that you see on the television screen. You can't, you notice if somebody's attractive or if they're ugly, I get a lot of that, the ugly parts, Like, what happened to him? I say, well, I was born in West Virginia. So, although I will say not everybody from West Virginia is ugly. I mean, Don Knotts is from there. So, there's a Hollywood hunk if you ever saw one. But I digress. Let me get back on track. It's the dwelling on. It's not just the observation, or if somebody comes into a room and you happen to notice, what they look like, good, bad, or otherwise. But it's the dwelling upon, the thinking upon in a lustful, a sexual manner. C.S. Lewis said, if you look upon ham and eggs with lust, you've committed breakfast in your heart. That is about the goofiest quote I have ever heard, and it sounds like something a stand-up comic would say, but it was C.S. Lewis who said that. Isn't that strange? But here's the way you can look at it. Here's one of the ways that I would explain it, is that if you look upon another person for the purpose of stimulating your sexual desire, that's what Jesus is getting at. It has to do with our intent, our purpose, in order to. Then lust is giving birth in our hearts, and it becomes sinful. It's not just the noticing somebody, but it's the dwelling upon, the looking upon, the gazing upon, and then dwelling on those thoughts. In fact, you could be all by yourself at home and still lust in your heart because of what can go on in the head. So adultery is not just something that can take place in a bed, it's something that can take place in the head. And we have to be very careful because this can give root to many other things that I'm going to talk about here concerning lust. Because you might think, well, what we deal with in our head, well, nothing's going to come of it and this and that. But we have to realize that lust can be a very persistent thing. That lust does not give up. That lust continues to batter a person. Someone described it like this, that if you bolt your front door, it'll rattle at your bedroom window. If you lock your back door, it'll seep through the television screen into your living room or wink at you through your computer screen. That lust is one of those things that continues to bombard people, and the more we entertain it, the more we yield to it, the stronger hold it's going to have on a person. Whereas the more we resist it, the less hold and strength that it has in our lives. So it's very important that we do not allow lust to build in our lives, because then it becomes an obsession in our lives that requires a great deal of strength to withstand. And so don't mess with temptation by allowing lust to build up in your heart. Now, again, you might say, well, but it's just something inside. It doesn't mean I'm going to cross that line. It doesn't mean I'm going to do anything physically. And a lot of people have reasoned that way, who ended up making that fatal trip and committing adultery. But just the thought, you might think you have it all under control. And besides, even if we don't go through with the act, Jesus says it's still sinful. But let's just consider the act itself. Okay, you say, well, I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to actually do anything. A battering ram can hit a fortress gate 1,000 times with seemingly no effect. But the 1,001st time, it might break that gate through. And in the same way, immorality is the cumulative product of small mental indulgences and minuscule compromises. The effects at times seem somewhat indiscernible. Here's a man that starts entertaining thoughts. Maybe he starts looking at pictures online or videos that are unwholesome, maybe even pornographic, and he starts thinking, well, it's all under control, it's just a thought. Or maybe he sees somebody that he knows and starts developing a friendship, and it all just seems so innocent. And yet those small compromises just build and build and build to where they become overwhelming. You see, that's what happens with lust. And that's one of the reasons why Jesus spoke so harshly about just the thought, because thoughts can build. And thoughts can then eventually get us into trouble. So we have to be very careful as Jesus describes these things, which leads me to verses 29 and 30, that I want to make a couple of statements related to those verses that will enable us to really build defenses against allowing this particular sin to creep into our lives and into our family. And here's one of the two things I want to say concerning verses 29 and 30. Extreme measures must be taken to prevent adultery. Extreme measures. Look what Jesus said in verse 29 and 30. He said, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out. Because it's better to go into eternity without that than to go into hell fully bodied. Or if your right hand offends you, to cut it off. Now understand, Jesus is not talking literally here. And obviously you don't see too many people going around with their eyes plucked out and their hands cut off. Because even if you did pluck your eyes out, even both of them, it wouldn't necessarily take care of the problem. You can still lust without your eyes because you still have your mind. And so Jesus is not talking literally. So what's he saying here? Jesus is saying that you need to do whatever you can to prevent this sin from getting a foothold in your life. You need to do whatever you have to do. I mean, if you need to change jobs to prevent an affair, if you need to move to another town to prevent an affair, or move to another department at your place of employment, whatever it takes. Now, I know some people might object to that and say, well, I've worked at this place for 20 years, and I'll never get a salary somewhere else. But listen, if you're headed toward an affair, what is the greater price to pay? So you keep the job, and you cheat on your spouse, and you lose your family and the respect of your kids. All that to keep a job? Jesus is saying, do whatever it takes to prevent this from happening. You see, everybody needs to have a healthy fear of the possibility of a fall. Everybody does. I know there are some people who might hear a sermon like this, like, oh, that never happened to me. But you know, just about every Christian, everybody who seeks the Lord, who's fallen morally, has said, I never thought I would do that. I never thought it would happen to me. Just about every Christian who's ever made that step, ever made that decision, has said, I never thought it would happen to me. I mean, how arrogant is a person who says, immorality may overtake Samson. Immorality may overtake David, who was a man after God's own heart. It may get Solomon, and it might get some of the greatest Christian leaders of our day, but it won't get me. And what kind of arrogance is that? To say that David, this mighty man of God, can fall, but you or I can't. And so you see, we need to have a healthy fear. Because if we don't, we won't take any precautions. We let our guard down. With a healthy fear, we say, well, I'm going to do what I need to do. I'll take whatever steps I need to take. Because if two people start to meld together in an emotional relationship, the powerful draw that is there is difficult. It's difficult to separate because there's a powerful draw there, and it gets often underestimated. And no Christian I've ever known, and by the way, this is a church problem. Let me just say, some people might say, I don't know why he's preaching on this. This is the only people out in the world deal with. This is a church problem. In the churches I've pastored, I've had people in my other churches come to me and say, my spouse has been cheating on me. My spouse had an affair. So this is a church problem. And nobody I've ever known has woken up one day and said, you know what, I'm going to go out and cheat on my spouse. It doesn't happen that way. I've never known anybody who just kind of woke up out of the blue and said, I'm going to go have an affair. It doesn't happen that way. At least very seldom. Almost always, it's something that takes place over time. In my car, I've been listening to an audiobook called His Needs, Her Needs. It talks about the various needs of men and women and how important it is to meet those in a marriage. And he says that he's counseled hundreds of couples where there's been an affair in their relationship. And he said this is often how it happens, because he's talking about how important it is for spouses to meet each other's needs. Now, obviously, you can't meet all the needs in your spouse. That never happens. But do our very best to meet those needs. And he says often, let's say you have a woman who, one of the greatest needs of a woman is for tender affection and to know that she's cared for and taken care of, and also for conversation. Women have a need to have a conversation partner, not just to talk, but also for the spouse to talk so they can know them better. And let's suppose that a woman meets a person at work and she's married to a man who hardly ever talks. She asks him how his day is, fine. Anything happened? No. And it's just no conversation. Whenever she talks, he's always distracted watching football or surfing the web and hardly ever pays any attention to her. He forgets her birthday. And he doesn't really show her the type of care that she needs. And she meets a man at work who is just bending over backwards to be with her, and he's very interested, genuinely interested in the things that she has to say. And he remembers her birthday, whereas her husband forgot all about it. He opens up about his life, and she's able to know him. And after a while, she finds herself drawn to this person. And this is a scenario that plays out over and over again every week in places all across our country. Or you have a man who maybe he's not getting any respect at home. Maybe his wife kind of belittles him and talks down to him, and maybe there's very little affection. Perhaps they hardly ever have sex together, and there's very little respect toward him. And he meets somebody at work, and she just thinks he's the greatest thing to ever walk on the earth. And she practically worships him. And she touches him on the arm one day and just sends chills through his body. And then after a while, as the relationship develops, he starts making excuses to get together with her. And this is how it happens. This is how it happens over and over. Nobody wakes up, at least not people I know of, and says, I'm just in the mood to have an affair. But it just generally slowly happens as relationships form over time and people get drawn in. And often by the time they realize what's going on, they're so hooked. It's like a drug. And it's often hard to stop it. I want to read some things to you, and none of this might seem relevant now, but it's just something to keep in mind in the future, just some questions to ask yourself with relationships of people that's not your spouse, okay? Am I creating excuses to meet with someone of the opposite sex? Like maybe at work, you say, well, I'm going to go in there and file these papers because I know he'll be in there. Or he might think, well, I'm going to stand here because I know she'll be walking this way here shortly. Are you making excuses? Number two, how am I handling repeated interaction with a particular person in a working or social relationship? In other words, are you keeping a professional tone? Number three, am I finding myself, this is a major one, okay, listen to this. Am I finding myself preoccupied with thoughts of another person? And if you're married, and if you're single, you can have thoughts of another person in a holy way. But if you're married, and you're finding your mind thinking about a particular person daily, listen, that is a major red flag. And you need to do something to break that somehow. Number four, how and why do I exchange gifts and cards with someone of the opposite sex? Generally speaking, you should not give gifts to somebody of the opposite sex. Unless, that comes from you and your spouse. But if you're married, you shouldn't be giving gifts and cards to someone of the opposite sex. Number five, has my phone become an important means of communication with somebody else? Texts, emails, phone calls. Number six, am I putting myself in a situation where I may meet a particular person that could become more than a friend? Number seven, what is my body language telling other people? Do you hold a look with somebody, longer than what is normal? Do you smile at a particular person a certain way? Do you nudge up against them when you're talking? See, these little things, these are communications to say, hey, I like you. And you're sending signals. So be careful. Be careful. These are ways that connect people together, and it's very, very dangerous. So extreme measures should be taken to prevent adultery, whatever it takes. Listen, your marriage is one of the most important things you have. One of the most important things you have. And don't destroy it by something as frivolous. You might say, well, it's not frivolous. I really like this person. Almost every time somebody cheats on a spouse and goes off with another person, if they do get married, they end up getting divorced too. They seem like the dream person. And then you get married and you find out they're just like everybody else. It's all the grass is greener thing, and it's just a myth. Okay, the last part of this, verse 29 and 30, is that extreme consequences result from adultery. Extreme consequences result. A guy named William Backus said there is probably no private act with as weighty of social repercussions as sexual intercourse. He said there's no private act with such heavy social repercussions as sexual intercourse. And I can't argue with that. I mean, it's the most private act two people can engage in, and if you engage in that with someone that's not your spouse, the social repercussions, the family repercussions, are it's a bomb. I mean, think of it as a fire. You know, I talked earlier about sex as something God created. Think of it as a fire. A fire in a fireplace is good, it's warm, it's inviting, it's comforting. You can put a fire in a furnace or in your oven, and you can use it to warm and to cook, and it's a good thing, right? We all love fire, especially in the wintertime. But if you get fire out of control, a blazing fire can destroy a home and take lives and destroy everything in its path. Sex is the same way. In the proper context between a husband and a wife, it's a beautiful thing that God ordained and created. But you let it get outside of those parameters, and it is a destructive force that tears people apart. Proverbs 5 and 6 have some of the strongest words about this particular topic. I want you to listen to these words in Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 3. It says that the lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb. Now, when it says strange, it doesn't mean weird. It means maybe someone you don't know. Anyway, it's talking about someone other than your spouse. The lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, and her steps take hold on hell. Think about that. You see, the writer does not dismiss the attractiveness of it, the allure of it. You know, he says that her mouth is smoother than oil, but it says at the end her steps go down to hell because it leads you astray. Proverbs chapter 6, beginning at verse 20 to 25, it says, "Lust not after her beauty in your heart, neither let her take you with her eyelids. For by means of a whorish woman a man is brought to a piece of bread." Did you get that? By means of a whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread. Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals and his feet not be burned? So is he that goeth into his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her will not be innocent. These are strong words from Scripture. And so I say them to say use wisdom, build your marriage. And it's not just preventing affairs that we need to focus on. We need to focus on building our marriage. Because I truly believe that the stronger your marriage, then the less likely you are to stray. So work on that marriage and make it strong. Listen, when it comes to an affair, and again, the focus is being on preventing such a thing. So I want to say this, and I know this is tough, but it's true, and we need to hear this. No amount of regret and no amount of remorse can compensate for an affair. Now, you can repent, and I hope that you would, and God forgives. God forgives, and God restores, and God can even build a marriage, and I've seen Him do that with people. God can bring about healing and restoration. But if you have an affair, it doesn't matter how sorry you are. It doesn't matter how much you cry at your spouse's feet. It doesn't matter the reasons that you give. It's not going to alleviate the pain that you've created. And so think about that. And if you're in a situation right now where in any way, shape, or form you think you might be headed down that direction, or if you ever are in the future, just consider the ramifications of the choices. Because there's nothing that can take that pain away. And it's something you'll have to work through for many years to come. Chuck Swindoll wrote a list of some things that happen after a person has an affair. And again, I say this waving the warning flag, okay? He says when immorality is discovered, here are some things that happen. Number one, your mate will experience the anguish of betrayal, shame, rejection, heartache, and loneliness. No amount of repentance will soften those blows. Number two, your mate can never again say that you are a model of fidelity. Suspicion will rob her or him of trust. Number three, the total devastation your sinful actions will bring to your children is immeasurable. Their growth, innocence, trust, and healthy outlook on life will be severely damaged. Number four, the heartache it will cause your parents, your family, and your peers is indescribable. Number five, the embarrassment of facing other Christians who once appreciated you, respected you, and trusted you will be overwhelming. Number six, if you are a pastor, you will suffer immediate loss of your job and the support of those with whom you worked. The dark shadow will accompany you everywhere and forever. Forgiveness will not erase that. Number seven, your fall will give others license to do the same. Number eight, the inner peace that you once enjoyed will be gone. Number nine, you will never be able to erase the fall from your mind or the mind of others. This will remain indelibly marked on your life's record, regardless of your later return to your senses. And number 10, the name of Jesus Christ, whom you once honored, will be tarnished, giving the enemies of the faith further reason to sneer and jeer. I mentioned Proverbs 5 a little while ago, and in verse 15, you know what a cistern is? C-I-S-T-E-R-N. It's a container for holding water, especially in countries where water is scarce, and they'll have cisterns. And in Proverbs 5:15, it says, drink water from your own cistern and running waters from your own well. What he's saying is, get your sexual gratification from your spouse. And he uses that as a metaphor. Get your thrills from your spouse. Okay? That's what he's saying. Not from other people. Keep it at home. Drink water from your own cistern. I'd like for you to stand with me as we prepare to pray. And I want to give you an opportunity here in a moment for you to pray with your spouse, if your spouse is here with you today. Lord, I thank you today for your word.